Welcome everyone to the Pearson Business Book Club. My name is Eloise Cook. I'm the publisher for the professional business list at Pearson. I'm hoping you can hear me okay today. We had some troubles last month. If you've not joined before, we choose a Pearson business or personal development book each month at the book club and invite the author on to discuss it. They'll also give a webinar on a key concept from the book. And if you need to leave halfway through, the video will be available to watch on demand at the book club website. So, what's our book today? So our book this month is Double Your Price by David Falzani. And if you haven't got a copy yet, you can buy it through the book club webpage. And I'm going to pop a link to the Pearson site in the chat. Let's see if this works. Go. Right, so our author today is Professor David Falzani, MBE. He's a serial entrepreneur, business consultant, and non-executive director. He has been a participant or co-founder in over 16 entrepreneurial companies, helping to scale up companies by over 1,000%. He has been a mentor and or trainer for growth programs at Nottingham University, Oxford University Said Business School, and the Royal Academy of Engineering, overall supporting over 2,000 companies. David is a professor at Nottingham University Business School and has published more than 60 articles and blogs, as well as the book Double Your Price, which published in May this year. So welcome, David. How are you?
Yes, thank you very much indeed for that very kind welcome, Eloise. Yeah, I'm very well indeed. How are you keeping?
Good. Yes, I'm excited for this session. It's something a bit different to what we've had before, and I'm sure you'll get lots of interesting questions.
Yes, I'm very much looking forward to hearing the feedback, and I'm trying to make today's sessions also interactive as well. So I'm hoping everyone have their fingers nicely warmed up to use the chat box and to offer some thoughts and suggestions as we go through our session together.
Absolutely, yes, that's a great suggestion. So we always ask the same questions at the beginning. So David, why did you want to write this book?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I'm sure and I've seen some of the previous sessions. I think the answers are always interesting. So why did I want to write the book? I think I had a real urge to share my experiences and observations. So as you kindly pointed out, Eloise, I spent over 25 years either building, starting, or growing businesses. So I've done that for my own companies, but I've also done that, of course, for many other companies, helping others, either as a consultant, as a professor, or as a mentor. And so having worked with hundreds of companies, I was really surprised to note that one of the key mistakes I saw repeated over and over again was underpricing or pricing incorrectly. And I saw many cases where this led to businesses essentially not achieving their full potential, or even worse, stuttering and then failing. And I saw many companies, even earlier in my career, where the company were providing a fantastic service, and it would go out of business, and all the customers would say, "What a shame that business is not around anymore. We really enjoyed that service. It was such a great thing." And I thought to myself, well, when you look at the prices they were charging, they were just not charging a fair enough rate to make themselves financially and commercially sustainable. So I saw this trend. I see it very, very, very often. It is, for me, perhaps the number one error in terms of frequency that I see when working with early stage and high growth businesses. And so I thought, well, let's look into this a little bit more. So I did, and then I came up with a body of practice around how to address these issues. They're often rooted to some sort of cognitive bias, a lack of confidence, essentially, within the management team, a fear. It's quite a complicated mechanism there. And so I wanted to write the book. I really wanted to try to help people get rid of that emotional baggage, reset their thinking about market. And it is a really interesting topic because it's part market theory, but it's also partly psychology, and it's partly about you, the business leader, how you think, how you frame things as well. So a really interesting topic. And as I said, I really was hoping to offer that reset and then offer people a way forward. So give them some exercises they can do. So follow the well trusted and tried formula of, here's some theory. Here's an example. Now work on a an exercise to perhaps in your own company to make use of those earlier steps. So that's essentially why I wrote it, to try and spread that word and try to help address this issue.
Absolutely, yes, and I can absolutely confirm that the content is really practical, so it sort of gets you doing stuff as you're reading along, so you can sort of put this sort of theory to practice. And was there anything that surprised you about writing the book?
I think the writing process itself was easier than I thought it would be, and perhaps that's because I was really passionate and really keen to do this. And I actually started before COVID, and then COVID I think probably slowed down some of the latter stages of just finishing it off. But I think my biggest surprise was the initial reaction I had when putting out even the drafts. So putting out drafts, and just a strong reaction from people saying, I looked at your draft, David. I wrote 9 pages of notes, and I'm going to buy 4 or 5 copies to share with my senior team at my company. So people had this very strong reaction to this idea about, let's rethink pricing. Let's be entrepreneurial. Let's try to, get rid of some of those assumptions. Let's take a fresh approach. So that feedback's been surprising and been really gratifying as well. It's been fantastic to hear.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Excellent. And finally, how do you want readers to feel about reading your book?
I'd like them to feel excited. I like them to feel excited about the opportunities that are posed and offered by pricing. And I want them to also feel empowered. So I want them to look at the book, to read it, and at the end to feel, okay, now I understand that for my business, out of the 20 or 30 ideas that David perhaps encompassed in the book, these are the 5 or 6 that can make a step change for us, for our company, for our field of practice. So I'm hoping those 2 things, to excite people and then to empower them. So again, to get them through that process, rethinking, reframing, get some valuable tools from the toolkit that's contained within the book, and then get them off doing things. And what I'd really like to do, of course, is hear back from people over the coming months or years about what they've actually done. And I've, when I was developing these materials at various places such as Oxford University and Nottingham University, companies would email me, months later and say, "Well, David, I did what you said, or I tried this, or I had this idea based on what you were talking about, and this is what happened to us. This is the outcome, this positive thing, or this thing we learned from it." So I'm hoping that we'll get that as well.
Yes, and I'd love to hear about those when they come in. Fantastic. Okay, so David will have his session next on pricing, why everything you think you know is wrong. If you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A function or enter stuff in the chat. Hopefully the chat is open. But yeah, David, over to you.
Fantastic. Let me share my screen. So that should come on now. And then Eloise, if you can just confirm that you can see that okay?
Yep, looking good.
Excellent. All right, good. So yeah, thrilled to be here. So hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening or good morning, depending where you are in the world. So pricing, why everything you think you know is wrong. So I hope we're going to have a really interesting session today. Just to recap what I said earlier, I've spent 25 years growing, starting, and helping others grow businesses of different sizes, SMEs, startups, and also larger organizations. And in particular, I've been very lucky that I've also been enabled to act as a trainer. So at Oxford University on the Goldman Sachs 10,000 program at the Saïd Business School there, and also through the Royal Academy on various programs, I've worked with many high growth or potential high growth businesses. And working with those really gave me some insights as to this pricing issue that are faced by many managers and directors. And I really wanted to get to grips with that. And that was the background, I think that's most pertinent from the various things that I've done that led me to this writing of the book, and also this area of practice around pricing. So in terms of an agenda, I'm going to very briefly talk about, traditional pricing, very brief introduction. Then perhaps highlight why price is so important before we move on to how you should actually be setting price. And I'll look at some current practices, bad, better, and then the best practice as well. And then we'll think about rethinking, or we'll look rather at rethinking pricing, and also about reference points as well. And these 2 sections are perhaps the more of the kind of like, well, I hope to surprise and delight you about some insights about pricing. So I'll look at some of the latest research, I'll revisit some more topics, and hopefully at the end of those 2 sections, you'll have an idea about, well, okay, I thought this was true, but actually it turns out it's not true, or perhaps there's a cognitive bias there that you become aware of that you can perhaps address, or indeed maybe use to your benefit within your own businesses as well. So that's the plan. Let's jump straight in. So let's jump straight in with a metaphor. So on the screen, you can see what looks like a supersized Rubik's Cube, essentially. And you can see two arrows. And the arrows are pointing to two squares that are a sort of a brownish kind of color. Are those two squares that the arrows are pointing at, are they the same color? Now let's try and use the chat box perhaps and just get some responses. A Y for yes or an N for no. Do they look like they are the same color? And then perhaps we can see what kind of responses we get. You can see we've got some chats coming through. So we've got lots of yeses, we've got a few yeses, we've got lots of no's. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, typically when I show this to people, about 90% of the audience say, yeah, they don't look at all the same color. They must be different. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll take the background image away on the right-hand side here. And now you can see the two squares look identical, don't they, in terms of color? Maybe you think, okay, well, maybe you've manipulated the image, David. Maybe you've done something here because it doesn't look like it should be the case. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to screen off on the left-hand side. So if you look at the left-hand cube and look at the two brown squares, and in particular look at the bottom square, I'm going to stage by stage mask off the background. And look at that bottom brown square, and at some point it may well change color for you. And so you can see at the end of that the two colors on the left are in fact identical. And let me just bring back the original image. So the two colors on the left are actually identical, and they are the same as the two colors on the right-hand side. Okay, so this is an optical illusion. Why are we talking about it in a pricing context? Because this is a good metaphor that the way that pricing works often in markets and with customers. Much of pricing and value recognition is about the framework. It's about the context, the reference points, the background, the decision-making landscape that the customers or consumers operate within. Ultimately, consumers and customers are not independently calibrated as to what good value is or is not. So they look for these reference points. So it's all about that background that gives you the contrast, or gives them the contrast to make a decision about value. Exactly like this image on the screen. The different backgrounds around those two squares make them look completely different color, although they're exactly the same. So this is a really valuable insight about pricing, and we'll come back to this point later on. So I've already said this once, but so 25 years of experience. I talked about underpricing being the most common, or one of the most common errors I see within businesses, small and large, but particularly the smaller, earlier stage or high growth businesses. And there are three reasons why I think people underprice. The first one is that they may have a lack of confidence in the value proposition. Now, just to remind you, the value proposition is the thing that you or the company does that the customers value, and they value it so much, they're willing to pay money for it. And hopefully it's some way different and maybe better than competitors. So a lack of confidence tends to undermine this pricing proposal. Number two, a fear of not enough sales to cover overheads. So there's this fear that if we don't make enough sales, we won't be able to pay our rent, or won't be able to pay the payroll perhaps. And so if we keep our prices low, we're more likely to get sales in. So there's some sort of elasticity. And the third one is the irregular setting of prices. Now, irregular in both senses. One, not doing it often enough. I do think it's something that should be done quarterly, even monthly, not annually or once every 3 or 4 years. And also irregular in the sense of the way that it's done as well. So the methodology, and we'll cover more about that. So when I saw all this, I decided about 10 years ago, working with some high growth businesses, to set a provocative challenge to help the entrepreneurs or the CEOs discard some of this baggage. So I said to them, can you run a test in your market to see what happens if you double your price? Is there a safe test that you can do? And to my delight, some companies actually did it and reported back. And when they reported back, they always said, and have always said, that they've learned something really interesting about their customers through this process, doing the double your price experiment. So one company, just to highlight an example, was growing in the East Midlands in the UK, and they were growing across the sort of middle part of the country. they attended a seminar and they decided that they wanted to move into the London market. But what they said is, with any business within the M25 motorway, so any business within London, they would double their prices. They would double their rate card. Now, to their delight and surprise, it made no difference in their conversion rate from leads to sales. So they got just as much business volume-wise, but of course their margins were improved eightfold. So they were far more profitable and able to reinvest back into their company. And what they learned was previously they were being considered as, or rather they were seen as being too cheap. And cheap means not very good. And so there was a whole raft of customers that they became eligible to when they doubled their price, because now they were seen as being credible. And so by moving up the value ladder, albeit perhaps at the cost or the price of losing some of the bottom feeding, very price sensitive customers, but by moving up the value ladder, they were able to now engage with much more premium customers that was much more sustainable for them as a business. And I'll build upon that story in a few minutes. Okay, so very briefly, traditional pricing, two very common approaches I see. They both have issues. One is cost plus pricing, which uses the cost to set the price. Issues abound, but in particular, do they really know the cost? Because of course you're setting price in advance of the business, and you don't know what the costs are until the end of the business period. And you're also assuming the costs don't change with respect to volume, for example. And then competition-based pricing, where you gauge or set your price relative to competitors. Now, if you match your competitors, are you saying to customers that you're the same as your competitors? You're a me too, you don't have any advantages? But more fundamentally, how did those competitors ever set that price? Who's to say that's the correct price point for that product in that market? So that these two approaches, and I'll show an example of each of these later on, they have some underlying problems. Okay, so let's talk about why price is so important. I'm going to run a little test here, and it's an unfair question, I know, in advance, let me say that. But there are two companies. There's company A and company B. So company A has got a price of 100. Company B has got a higher price of 130. Now, company A, 60% of their leads convert to sales. Company B, only 40% of sales convert, only 40% of leads convert to sales. And maybe that's because of their higher price. So the unfair question, and I know it's unfair, is which company do you think is more profitable, A or B? And please do use the chat box. And by way of background, I've used very standard assumptions here about how big the margins are, gross margin, operating expenses as a ratio of sales and so on. I'll give you just a few moments there to type in which one you think is the more profitable. I can see answers coming in, which is fabulous. Good. Okay, so we've got a very sophisticated audience today. Lots of people are saying B, a few people are saying A. So normally when I do this in front of an audience, about 2/3 of the audience will say company A. And actually, it's company B. That's not only more profitable, but it's twice as profitable as company A. Now, on the screen, you can see the little P&Ls that led to that calculation, and you can see it also in the book and also on the website for the book. But as I say, I'll use very standard assumptions around margins and ratio of cost to sales and so on. But don't take my word for this result. I'm going to show you some other evidence. So Harvard Business Review looked at 2,500 companies across multiple sectors, and they asked the following question and answered it as well. So the question is, what happens if you make a 1% improvement in price or variable cost or volume or fixed cost? What change does that create in terms of operating profit? And what they found on average, again, across 2,500 companies, a 1% improvement in price gave an 11% improvement in profit. So price is by far and away the biggest lever, the biggest driver to profit compared to all the other factors in business. And what's particularly interesting, I find, about these four parameters that the Harvard research used was the third one down, volume. Because volume has another name in business language as well, a word or a couple of words that we use far more frequently. Volume is also called sales or revenues. And so the Harvard research is saying that basically a 1% increase in price has almost 4 times the effect on profit as a 1% increase in sales. And that's very surprising for some people, because in a lot of businesses, we're very top line driven. Everyone's focused on sales and revenue, and that's that's the mantra and what everyone pursues. And actually, here's price by far and away outperforming volume increases in terms of bangs for buck or in terms of how big that lever is. That was the Harvard research. It said 11%. Now, McKinsey did some research in B2B looking at distributors, and they estimated that a 1% price increase yields on average about a 22% increase in EBITDA. Let's call it profit. So this is an exercise which you can do, and it's in the book, something that everyone should be doing for their own companies, work out their own price leverage. So what's the leverage or the relationship between a 1% increase in price and what effect that has on the bottom line? A really important thing to do to understand about your business. Why is all of this important? Well, because to grow as a business, you need to be able to reinvest. And we all know that cash is king, and cash is derived from profit. So the more profit we have, the more cash we have, and we can reinvest that back in. Now, any growth business has got an internal rate of return, or an IRR of 25%, 35%, maybe 50%, possibly higher. So your business is a bit like a bank account. For every pound or dollar that you're able to reinvest back into the company, you get that fantastic, 25%, 30% compound interest rate every year. So if you're able to generate excess of financial value and reinvest that back in, then basically you can get that marvelous hockey stick shape. So company A here and company B, let's contrast them. So company A has a lower price, and each year it takes out its profits, maybe as dividends. Now, company B has got a higher price, much nicer margins, and it reinvests that back into the company and gets that wonderful internal rate of return. And you can see the different outcomes in terms of total company value after 10 years. So higher prices means that you have higher profits. You can reinvest that back into your staff training. You can have happier, more effective, more engaged staff. And I know CEOs are very interested in looking after their staff. Also, you can reinvest that back into better products, better services. That, of course, leads to happier customers and indeed more premium products and services. So this is a virtuous circle here. This is a reinforcing circle. And really, this lies at the heart of why price is so important. Because if you're able to initiate this virtuous circle, then you can drive your businesses forward. You can grow. And it has all kinds of positive social impact as well. So I've talked about early stage and high growth businesses, but large corporates too. Let's look at one recent corporate collapse. So the travel agency, Thomas Cook, ceased trading in 2019, leaving 21,000 staff and 600,000 customers stranded. Final year losses in their final trading year after tax was a £163 million loss. So the question I like to ask is, well, how much of a price rise would have allowed Thomas Cook to break even in that final year? Now, we've already seen the huge lever that is price when it comes to profit. Nonetheless, it might surprise you that just a 1.7% increase in the average transaction value that they made during that year, let's call that price, would have done the trick. It would have taken them to break even. And the point really to take from this is, I wonder to what extent, the board of directors of a firm such as Thomas Cook were really engaged with pricing as a topic. Were they fully aware of its importance? Were they fully aware of its ability to help them make their business sustainable? Was it something that they regularly discussed? Was it a standing item on their agenda? Or was it perhaps delegated down to the middle management and left to be perhaps a once a year or some other kind of mechanism to help run that process? It's a question I ask. I don't know the answer, but I think it's an interesting question. Okay, so how should we set price? Well, let's start with a thought experiment. So let's start with a fantastic thought experiment about a widget. So you have a product or a widget, and it creates £1 million of value for customers. Now, it doesn't matter exactly how it does it, but maybe it produces £1 million of cost savings for the average customer, or maybe it produces extra sales that lead to about £1 million of extra profits for your average customer. £1 million. So on the right-hand side there's the cherry pie of value. You're creating £1 million. There are no competitors. Fantastic. There are no substitutes. Marvelous. So what price should you now charge the customer? And I'm going to invite you all to put a number in the chat box, please. It creates $1 million or £1 million of value for the customers. How much should you charge the customer for this? Anyone willing to suggest a number? It's somewhere between £0 and £1 million. So someone's saying 15%. So thank you. That's very sensible. 150,000. Thank you very much. Thank you, Robert. Anyone else? I'll wait for one more. No? Okay, all right. So yeah, so okay, so 100,000. I don't know. Yeah, some people say 50%. They say, you know, it was sort of split the difference or meet in the middle. So you've got £1 million of value. So, you know, 50% for us, 50% for the customer. So some people say, well, 500,000. That way we're splitting this economic value between the two groups. So the slice on the right-hand side there on that picture would be half and half. Other people say, so yeah, 500,000, thank you. So, okay, so you know, those sort of numbers, 150,000, we've got 250, 500,000. Okay. All right, let's add some additional information. So part B, so the production cost of this widget, this product, is only £1,000. What price should you now charge the customer with this additional information? What do you think? Same. Thank you, Rob. Yeah, absolutely. Nothing has changed, does it? Nothing has changed. And yet, production costs today remain a very common anchor that people use in setting price. So in cost plus pricing, someone would take that £1,000 production cost or cost of supply, they'd add a markup, let's say 100%. So they would charge just £2,000 for this amazing product that creates £1 million of value. And that's likely to be an unsustainable price, isn't it? Whereas a value-based approach would say, well, okay, we've created £1 million of value in our cherry pie value there on the right-hand side. And let's take 25% of it as an example. And that would be a typical sort of ratio. So the price here would be 250,000. Okay, all right. So how should you set your price? So hopefully that was an interesting thought experiment. So there are many, many, many approaches to setting price, but there are three most common: cost plus, competitor-based, and customer value-based pricing. And I'm going to look at each of those in brief. So let's start with cost plus. And I'm going to call cost plus as a bad pricing approach, despite its enduring popularity. It is hundreds of years old, but people still use it, and they should almost never use cost plus to set price. It's okay as an accounting thing to make sure you're making money and financial controls, but as a way of setting price, it's a really bad approach. How does it work? So let's say that we've worked out our total costs for the year. Let's say £100,000. We delivered 1,000 units or 1,000 pieces of work. So the cost of supply is therefore, you divide one by the other, it's £100. We then apply a markup. So for example, it might be 60%, and the price therefore is 160. Now, one of the reasons people like this approach is because these are all knowns. These are all things that we can measure, whereas like the customer, the external environment, much harder to measure. Nonetheless, it is a truly bad approach to pricing because it's entirely introspective. And what we should be doing in today's sophisticated markets is that we should be looking out at customers. We should be looking at customers. How do we increase customer value? How do we make our customers' lives better? How do we delight, surprise our customers? How do we create long-lasting relationships? This, by contrast, is entirely introspective, isn't it? It's entirely inward-facing. And that's why I really dislike cost plus. Competitor-based pricing, I'm going to call that better. So it's a way really of looking at your relative points. So on the right-hand side here, we've got a graph. So we can chart on this the price of all the products and all the competitors within the category or the market. So price vertically and horizontally, we can put in the perceived performance level of those different customers. And that, as an exercise, is something that everyone should do. It's a really important and valuable exercise. However, the temptation when people use this approach is to say, well, if we underprice our competitors by 5%, our offering is as good as theirs, so we should pick up lots and lots of their business. Now, this can be an error because what the customers hear is something quite different. What they hear is, well, look, the best offering is only 5% more expensive. Let's not cut corners. Let's spend the extra 5% and get the best. The strategy can backfire. Meanwhile, the 5% discount that the company is offering, how much does that reduce the company's profits by? Well, we know it's roughly 11% per 5. So, of course, it's by a massive 55%. Let me just say that again. The 5% discount is reducing the company's profits by 55%. So competitor-based pricing, better. It's looking at the commercial marketplace. Definitely a valuable exercise, but there is a better approach beyond this. And that is value-based pricing. And I'm going to call that the best approach. So in doing this, we calculate the value generated for the customer. And as I mentioned earlier, that generally it's one of two things. Either it's the cost savings that are produced, or it's the increased profits produced for the customer. And typically, and this is particularly true and easy to calculate in B2B, once you've calculated how big that value pie is, so again, the cherry pie of value or the apple pie of value, typically in B2B, the norms are between 15 and 25% of this value is taken as the price. So the size of the slice that you take is between 15 and 25%, and the rest of the value goes to the customer, and they enjoy that benefit through the transaction. So value-based pricing, it's really great because you're thinking about customer value. And the more you look at customers, I find, and I've noticed, the more successful companies become. So let's move on to some of the more kind of like rethinking and trying to get rid of perhaps some of the baggage that might be out there in terms of pricing. So I talked about this fantastic scattergram, a really good exercise to do. And we can do this for many categories of products. We can do it for soaps, cosmetics, so on and so forth. And we can map basically the different price points occupied by different products. And we can also map their perceived performance horizontally. Now, perceived performance is really important, that first word. It's about perception rather than reality. Nonetheless, what we typically see is some sort of linear relationship, whereby if you want more performance, you have to pay a higher price. And that might in some way account for the price difference between the highest and the lowest product within that category. It might be down to the performance aspect. However, I've done this study many times. However, often when you look at some of these categories and look at these different products at these different price points, the products are actually identical. What do I mean by that? I mean that functionally and in terms of their base ingredients, in terms of their ability of doing the job, they are identical. So I've done this analysis with soaps and I've looked at their ingredient lists, and actually they're all the same, even though they're selling at very different prices. Cosmetics, again, you look at their basic functionality, their core ingredients, they're all the same, but vastly different price points. Clothes, I started an internet clothing business back in 1999. One of the first clothing companies on the internet. And what I noticed very quickly was that our clothes were made in the same factories, on the same machines, with the same workers, and the same fabrics as the super premium designer brands. And the only difference between them was the little label that had the designer name in it. Painkillers as well, and many, many different categories. And let me demonstrate this with a couple of examples. So this is one of my favorites to look at is table water, so still table water. So I went to my local supermarket. I noted down the prices, and I worked out the unit price, so price per litre of these different waters in my local supermarket. And for perceived performance here, I kind of just took a guess, really. I kind of thought, well, maybe these are different levels of perception. But the interesting thing was the 600% price difference between the cheapest and the most expensive water. Now, what's the active ingredient of water? It's H2O, right? Which is 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom bonded together. So by definition, the H2O molecule of the cheapest water must be identical to the H2O molecule of the most expensive water. So if we think of water as a way of hydration, these are all identical. There is no difference in them from a functional point of view. Now, however, of course, there are differences in terms of the branding, the packaging, and the associated bundle of messaging that goes with that. And this is a really important point. But from a functional point of view, these are all identical. Let's look at one other examples. There are many more in the book, but let's look at paracetamol. So these are paracetamol prices per tablet on the vertical axis. They're all 500 milligram medical grade paracetamol. And you can pay, in this case, 5 pence per tablet, or you can go all the way up to 19 pence for a branded tablet. And again, they all have exactly the same amount of the same medical grade paracetamol in them. The difference being the branding, the associated emotional values created by the different packaging, the branding, and as I say, the messages around that. So that's a really important thing. So the emotional value element, and we sometimes think of that as branding, as a catch-all, but it's also about the messaging, the visualization of the product and so on, the way it's portrayed. The emotional value is one of the big differentiators, and that's what's justifying these enormous price percentage differences. So the question for you, of course, is to think, well, okay, how functionally am I thinking about my product or service? And should I be thinking more about how do I create emotional value for my customers? And in the book, there's a couple of mechanisms and a couple of tools that you can do to start thinking about that, about how to build more emotional value so that you can make the lives better of your customers in new and interesting ways. Let's now talk about cognitive bias, in particular about priming. So let's look at this little exercise here. So a bat and a ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? This is a fantastic little exercise from Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. Just giving you a moment to think about it. But does anyone want to put in a number into the chat? How much does the ball cost? So we've got a couple of answers coming in. Anyone going to put a number out there? We've got one coming in. So a bat and ball together are $1.10. The bat is $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Thank you, Michael, for your comment. So 10. Yeah, so again, when I do this with large audiences, the number that people are either screaming out or they're desperate to try not to scream out is 10 cents, because that's the number our system one part of our brain is trying to tell us, look, the difference between 1 and 1.10 is 10 cents, so the answer must be 10 cents. And of course it isn't. The answer is 5 cents. And so this is an example, again, from Daniel Kahneman about priming bias and the way that our brain thinks about information. So I'll give you another example, because I know we're a little bit short on time today. So more priming bias. So John is intelligent, industrious, impulsive, and so on. Mark is jealous, stubborn, critical, and so on. Who do you prefer, John or Mark? And this is from Consumerology by Philip Graves. It's a really interesting exercise because, you know, again, 90% of the audience will say John, but of course the two here are identical. They're exactly the same. They all have exactly the same traits. But priming bias is where our brain recognizes or assumes that what comes first is best. So the only difference between John and Mark is the order in which the various attributes are listed. They are actually identical, but our brain assumes that whatever comes first basically provides the answer. And then there's a kind of a decreasing importance of things that follow. So priming bias, how do you use priming bias in your business? Do you think about the order in which you convey messages to your clients? Is there, maybe you have 5 messages that you like to tell people about why to buy your product. Have you thought about changing that order? Have you thought about different segments in the market? Maybe the order is more appropriate for others than other segments, for example. So think about that priming bias, think about the order. It's a very strong bias, and there's lots and lots of examples of this in the book, and also if you look on the internet as well. Really interesting area. Price is often a messenger. So without any other information, would you rather live in a £250,000 house or a £500,000 house? Would you rather drive a £10,000 car or a £50,000 car? This is where it gets more interesting. Would you rather fly in a plane with a pilot earning $100,000 a year or $25,000 a year? Would you rather be operated on by a surgeon earning £80,000 or £400,000? Now, many of you will be going for the higher price option for each of these, particularly the last two. But ask yourself why. What is it that is driving you towards that? What set of assumptions have you made or are you making actively about these different price point levels? And so price is often a messenger where without any other information, the more expensive something is, the better it is, essentially. So think about the messaging you're giving out with your product, with your pricing strategy. What messaging are you giving the customer? And is it appropriate for where you want to be in terms of a business strategy? So this is an example without any other information, with different price points. Let's look at an example with extra information. So this is a fantastic wine tasting experiment that was done at Caltech and Stanford. And there were 4 wines A, B, C, and D. Now, so this was a blind tasting. So unknown to the test subjects, wines A and B were actually the same wine. They were a $5 wine, but they were told that A was $5 and B was $45. And then C and D were actually the same wine, but again, the subjects were told there were 2 different wines. They were told C was $10 and D was $90. And so if you have a look at this chart here, let me just get up my laser pointer here. You can see here that wines A and B, they're actually the same wine here. And the true cost of the wine was $5 out of interest. So when the participants were asked to score how much they liked the wine, how good did it taste, the same wine basically tasted twice as good when they were told it was a $45 bottle of wine compared to being a $5 bottle of wine, even though the wine was the same. And the same with C&D. So C&D was actually a $90 bottle of wine, but the taste score, or the feedback score, how much people liked it, was roughly half as much when they were told it was a $10 wine as when it was a $90 wine. So this is really interesting, isn't it? So in the previous example, previous slide, there was no other information, but here we have additional information. They're actually getting to taste the product, and yet they're liking the wine twice as much when they're told that it's a wine with a much higher price point, even in fact when the wines are identical. So really interesting. Let's add one additional bit of information here. How about if we take out the price information? Well, in this case, A and B got roughly the same score for how good they tasted, which is unsurprising given they are the same wine. And C and D were given the same scores as well. So you can see A and B here the same, C and D the same. So you take away the pricing information, people are much more, rational perhaps. But that pricing anchor has a huge effect on how good they report the quality of the wine is, how much they enjoyed it. Now, there's one other element to this research, because the blind tasting was actually done within a functional MRI scanner. And the scanner was looking at the reward centers of the brain. So the parts of the brain associated with reward and looking for, whether, the blood flow within those areas were changing for different parts of the test. And indeed, it did show a very strong correlation. So if we look at the top chart here, we can see on the vertical axis here, we essentially have the blood flow or the signal change going on in the part of the brain associated with reward, with pleasure. And you see that the $45 wine has a much higher physical reward being delivered than the $5 wine. And for the bottom chart, it's even stronger. The $90 wine here, you can see, is creating a much better physiological or physical reward compared to the $10 wine. Again, for the same wine. So these two wines are the same, and the top two wines are the same. So this is absolutely fascinating, isn't it? Because now we're thinking, well, okay, so many studies have showed that if you give the same product to people at a higher price point, they report it as being a better product. But now it appears not only are they reporting that they're getting a better flavor, but they're actually getting more physical reward as well. So this tends to suggest that basically people see a higher price as being better, period, full stop. And that's a really interesting, fascinating insight. And there's a lot of research being done, continuing to be done in this area as well. So people then choose on value, not value for money. So this is quite a provocative claim. Let me try and substantiate it. So let's think we're going to buy a laptop. There's three laptops. There's a $300 laptop, a $1,000 laptop, and a $3,000 laptop. Which offers the best value for money? Let's say that we're looking for value for money. Okay, all right. Well, maybe we can come up with a list of criteria. So we can say, well, we want to do word processing, we want to watch movies, we want a good battery life and a weight, we want a low weight. So we can basically allocate points to each of these laptops. Let's put it up on a chart, and you can see the different relative strengths. But it doesn't really answer the question, well, what's the best value for money? We can answer it if we think about, well, how much extra value do we get from moving from no laptop to $400 laptop, and then up to the next one and up to the next one? And what we can see is that going from no laptop, obviously you can't do any of those things, to the $400 laptop gives you 22 points extra in score. If we go from $400 to $1,000, there's only an extra 3 points. And if we go up to the next one, 3,000, there's only an extra 2 points. So clearly, the best value for money laptop is the $400 laptop. However, what's the leading laptop brand in the UK? What's the most popular brand? I'm sure many of you are thinking of premium brands. So things like MacBook, Apple, and you can do the same analysis of mobile phones, incidentally, in which case the answer is absolutely Apple as being the most popular by far, having the highest market share of any phone. And yet, if it was about value for money, then consumers should be choosing as their number one choice. The market leaders should all be discount products, but they're not, are they? They're all premium products. So people don't choose on the basis of value for money in an objective sense. They actually choose on value, which is something slightly different. So the research shows that consumers in particular, but people, human beings in general, aren't able to judge value for money, despite believing they can. So they don't choose the most bangs for buck in an objective way. Instead, and this is a really important statement, they choose the most personally rewarding option at a price they can afford. Now, they might call that value for money, but objectively it's not. So this is a really important insight for B2B, but particularly for B2C, because in B2C it's harder to assign commercial or financial value to a product in B2C when you're working with consumers. But this is a great insight as to how consumers think. And companies use these kind of insights to think about, okay, how do I make things more rewarding within different budget levels? More broadly, for all business leaders, such as ourselves, this means finding out what value means to your customer. So that's really a prime objective from a strategic point of view and a growth point of view. Now, McKinsey did a study on this. They looked at 130 distributors, and they asked the customers of those distributors, what do you value most? What's most important for you in choosing the distributors that you choose? And what you can see here, a diagram of those answers. So range of products was the most important thing, then product availability, then customer service, then the sales rep relationship, and then delivery, and then pricing. So pricing was only the sixth most important thing. So I wonder what it is for your customers in your businesses and whether you've managed to do this analysis. And if not, maybe you can find other analysis to use as proxies and examples to help drive your own decision making as well. Okay, just a couple of more slides. So let's think about reference points. So this is a typical kind of pricing menu that I see in the high street. So typically this would be like something like a coffee shop. So you're walking down the high street or the main square in your town, and you think, well, I could do with a coffee. So you go into a shop and you think, okay, £1.80, I can get a cup of coffee. But then something curious happens. Let's explore this journey. You scan across and you see, well, for 20 pence more, I can have a coffee that's twice as big, coffee the size of a bucket. And then you think, well, hang on, for another 20 pence, I can have a coffee that's twice as big as again, it's the size of a skip. So you think, okay, this is interesting. So what's the most popular size coffee typically? The answer is medium followed by large. So if that's the case, then why does small exist here? Why does small exist and why is it so close to medium? Well, the answer, of course, is it's being used to encourage customers to buy medium and large. So this is a form of tactical pricing where the price points, the reference points, so think back to that Rubik's Cube type example right at the beginning. So the reference point that's being, frankly, manipulated in this case is to direct people to buy medium and large. I'll give you one more example. So just to explain that, so customers, as I said, they tend to define alternatives as gains as losses, or losses relative to some sort of external reference, because people aren't, as again, independently calibrated. They look for external touch points in order to establish whether something is high or low, whether it seems like good value and so on. And that might be past experience, it might be competitors, so alternatives. The question is to ask, do you know your customers' reference points? And in what way do companies in your sector affect those reference points for your customers? Two really important questions. But this idea of relativity is really important. And again, that's what that colored cube, the Rubik's Cube type thing at the beginning was all about. So I'll give you one more example. This was from Dan Airley. I think he's at MIT now. He did some work on The Economist's US pricing. And the web-only subscription for The Economist was $59. Or you could have web plus print, so a print copy of the magazine delivered to your door for $125. So he did a little survey and he said, well, how many people would go for each? So in his audience, 68% of people went for the cheaper option and 32% went for web plus print. So if you take a weighted average of that for the business, that's an average spend of $80 per customer. Now he did something interesting. He introduced another price point between those two. So now there was still print only for $59, but there was also print only for $125 or web plus print for $125. You think, well, why would anyone go for that middle option? For $125, you can have web plus print. Why would you go for print? So he took this and he ran it again with the same subjects or similar group of subjects. And this time the decision shifted substantially. So now only 16% chose the web-only subscription. Reassuringly, no one chose the middle option of print only, 0%. But now it went up to 84% chose web plus print subscription. So previously it was 32%, now 84%. So the average spend has shot up to $114, which is an increase in 30% in terms of average price. So we all know what 1% increase can do. So 30% increase is an enormous effect on the business. So what's going on here? Well, this is called decoy pricing. That middle additional print-only subscription here essentially drives customers to choose the web plus print. And again, null or decoy pricing sets up a slightly less attractive option, which makes its pair look disproportionately superior. So again, companies do this. These are techniques that are being used. And as consumers, it's good that we know about these things to perhaps help protect ourselves. So a couple of more slides. So doing the double your price experiment. So what is this experiment? So basically, is there a safe test that you can run for your business? It's got to be safe. So maybe a ring-fenced experiment. We don't want to endanger the current business. But if we can conduct this experiment and see what happens if we actually double our price in the market. Companies have come back and told me they've done this. They've done this in occasions such as when entering a new market. So they can kind of do a reset. They can start again. When launching a new product, or indeed by launching a parallel product, which is to say a product that's essentially the same from a functional point of view, but very different in terms of the messaging, the branding, maybe the packaging that's associated with it, trying to create much more emotional value at a much higher price point, of course. And it's really interesting. And as I say, everyone who's done this has come back and said, we've learned something really interesting. And some people double their price, some people increased it by 30%, some it was 20%. But all those numbers, as we know, are really big in terms of the effect they have on the bottom line. Now, for people who can't do the experiment for whatever reason, there is a light version. So you can do double your price light. And that's a thought experiment. And the thought experiment works like this. You imagine you're selling your product at twice the current price point, and then you sit down with your team and said, okay, this is the reality. What must have happened in order to support that reality? And it's a really interesting exercise because it forces the whole team to re-examine the customer's world. And so what's driving the customer behavior? What's their perception of a value? What's their decision-making landscape and so on? So it's a really interesting thing to do. There are, of course, many other strategies that companies use for price increases in a positive and a negative social sense. I won't go through these today, but they are all examined to some degree within the book as well. And it's a really interesting area. But if there are business leaders on this call today, then I would say perhaps the number one hint would be to think about enhancing emotional value, because that's perhaps the area where I see least innovation with businesses. Busy businesses got plenty to do. You don't perhaps think about this enough. But building enhanced emotional value is a fantastic way of moving your product up the value ladder. So what have we covered? We've covered quite a bit. So pricing is really important, but as I say, very underappreciated in my experience only of working with companies. We want that virtuous circle where companies have got higher margins. They can reinvest back into staff, products, service, so they can grow and help grow the economy. Price should ideally be linked to customer benefits. So I talked about value-based pricing, examining how much value you deliver for customers, but with also appropriate reference to competitors and substitutes. And that is such a valuable exercise to do, the scattergram. Humans are often not as rational as they think they are. So find out how your customers judge value. And again, it's not value for money, it's value. Find out how they think, how they're wired when it comes to value. A large proportion of value today is emotionally derived. So remember the water scattergram, the H2 molecule is the same, 600% ratio associated with emotional value. And then exercises such as double your price experiment, and exercises in general are just fantastic ways of trying to get step change insights into your business so that you can grow and prosper and do well. So just my final slide, just putting up the book again, which Louise showed earlier. The book contains lots of exercises designed to be very practical, actionable guidance in there. So back over to you, Eloise.
Wow, thank you, David. That was really interesting. So many sort of thought-provoking examples and ideas. Definitely food for thought. Right, so we'll have a few minutes for questions. I can see that one's come in already. I'll fire away because I'm conscious of time. Do you think it's valid for companies to increase price simply because of increased costs or inflation? I wondered if this would come up. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's an interesting topic, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, I think what's happened with inflation has actually made it easier for companies to increase prices because now customers are kind of expecting it. But I think it is okay to pass on cost increases if that means that you can stay in business. So as long as the important thing I think, and the message I've tried to reinforce is this idea about you need to be able to reinvest back into your business. You need to be able to improve your service, improve your product. That benefits the customer, but also look after your staff, invest in them correctly as well. In order to do that, you need to have the money to do it. So if that means that you have to raise prices, then yeah, absolutely. But also look beyond that. So inflation has opened the door, but there are opportunities, I think, to move our products and services further up the value ladder. So think more about premium offerings. So how do we add value beyond what we were doing before inflation? Inflation now has made it a little bit easier maybe to convey this to customers. But again, if we're giving them more, then they're willing to pay more as well.
What is your advice if it's difficult to quantify the value for the client? What if the product is less tangible?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So yeah, absolutely, and particularly with B2C, where you're working with consumers, it's harder to make a sort of financial assessment. But as I mentioned in brief, if you're able to work out how they gauge value, what is value to them? As I said, people tend to choose products which they find most rewarding at a price they can afford. So you can segment your market into different pricing tiers, or maybe you've already done that and chosen some, and think about, well, okay, how do I increase personal reward for my individual customer groups? And that might be through some research, it might be through some clinics, or it might be, as I say, running some experiments and just seeing how they react to different bundling or different aspects of your value proposition. And all of this is linked back to the value proposition, everything I've really been talking about today. So value proposition linked to customer understanding. And if you're able to do that, then you can make things more rewarding for them, and then hopefully they'll buy more, or indeed buy more premium versions of whatever you're doing.
Right. And do you have one more example of adding emotional value?
Well, let's think about Apple as one of the best examples about emotional value. Apple, they generally charge the highest prices in any category that they're in, and people buy Apple because it makes them feel good. They don't buy Apple because, okay, they are fast and they look good and so on, but it's all about the emotional environment, isn't it? So it makes people feel good about their product, about themselves, about their lives, about whatever they're doing. And so Apple are brilliant at this, and they do this through many, many different ways. And a few Googles will probably furnish some examples and some more details. But yeah, Apple's just a great example of doing it. It's about making them feel better, essentially, is the bottom line.
Interesting. Right. One more's come in. We'll do that and then we'll move on. What if the market pricing is very competitive? Even your product can add value, but your client has limited budget and they may intend to choose lower price products. So yeah, so what if it's very competitive?
So there are very competitive industries, of course. The way to best, triumph over competition is to have really clear differentiation. So ways that your product is different to your competitors, and those ways in which you differentiate yourself are valuable to your customers. So it all comes down again to finding valuable ways that you can distance yourself from your competitors, make yourself different and different in a useful way to your customers. And again, that's usually about trying to understand more about the customer's lives and trying to find out more about their buying environment. It might be about making things easier for them. The McKinsey list that I showed, showed from a B2B setting how customers think, what's important to them. So if you can understand more about that and then tell them about it, don't forget that really important step. Sometimes companies come up and they improve things, but they don't bother to tell their customers about it. Tell your customer about it, explain the fantastic improvements you've made, then hopefully you differentiate yourself from your competitors, differentiate yourself from your competitors in a way that's useful and valuable to your customers. And again, I always think about those competitive environments. It's all about making it easier for your customers. Sales growth and sales success. If you can make it easy for the customers to say yes, then you're going to be more successful in sales, particularly when there's competition.
Fantastic. Right, so I'm just going to pop this on the screen again. If people want to stay in touch, they can find you on LinkedIn and also at the University of Nottingham website. If people do try these things out, I hope they'll get in touch with you and let you know how it's worked out. I'd love to know as well. And yeah, definitely food for thought here at Pearson too. And next time, our October book of the month is Going Digital by Lindsay Jones and Balvinder Singh Power. And their webinar is What Works and What Doesn't in Business Transformation Projects. And I know that book has lots of interesting examples and stories too. So I think that will be very interesting. So that's Thursday, the 26th of October at 2 p.m. UK time, and you can register at the book club website. So thank you everyone for your questions and being engaged. Thank you, David. This was fantastic, and we'll upload this recording to the website. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you everyone. Thanks so much for your interactions, and thank you so much, Eloise. Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. See you soon. Bye.